Sequels are a very complicated thing to pull off correctly because, as has been proven many times over, there are seemingly a million different ways things can go wrong, up to and including a lack of understanding for why the first movie worked, trying to copy the original too closely, or taking the story in the wrong direction. But that being said, there are a few sequels out there that did manage to be truly different from the original in ways that some might not have seen coming. However, in these cases, that can actually serve to the movie's detriment, as if it's too different from its predecessor, fans of the original might find it very off-putting. And one of the best examples of this would be Gremlins 2, The New Batch. Going into full-on crazy comedy and self-satire while abandoning the horror aspects of the first one almost entirely, this is one sequel that is highly divisive among fans of the original, specifically because its approach is so different. And today, I'd like to go over what does and doesn't work about Gremlins 2, The New Batch, both as a sequel and its own movie. And there will be spoilers for both Gremlins movies ahead, so in case you haven't seen either of them yet but would like to, you should probably come back to this video another day. You have been warned. Okay. So what's interesting to note about Gremlins 2, The New Batch, is that it's more a satire of the original Gremlins movie and less a sequel to it. Sure, the movie does continue the story of the characters and introduces bigger threats for those characters to face, so on the surface it does cover all the basics of being a sequel. But it also covers almost all the same beats as the original, only everything is played for wackiness or to make fun of how it played out in the original, which is much more in line with what a satire does. And this is what makes Gremlins 2, The New Batch, such a strange sequel, because it's both a continuation and parody of the original movie at the same time. And most film experts, which granted I most definitely am not, would argue that it actually does a pretty good job of being both those things, which is a rather impressive feat. But at the same time, it's also easy to see why that approach didn't really make a connection with audiences. Because for one thing, the original Gremlins movie, though really popular, was already a bit hard to categorize. Chris Columbus, who wrote the original script, envisioned it as a straight horror movie where a lot more people died and was just overall more graphic. Like, Billy's mom didn't survive the kitchen scene in his draft, for example. But both the movie's director, Joe Dante, and producer Steven Spielberg wanted a lighter tone, and as a result, most of the deaths were cut and was just overall given a lighter atmosphere, relying heavily on camp to keep things from getting too scary. And honestly, that might have been part of the reason the movie did so well, specifically because it wasn't just another horror movie where creatures go on a rampage and a bunch of people die, which made it feel very different. In other words, the mixture of straight horror and camp helped to deliver a more unique horror movie than most others made in the 1980s. Though what also helped was Steven Spielberg's insistence on having Gizmo stay a Mogwai and become Billy's sidekick. Though I already spoke at length about that in my video on the director, which you can find a link in the description to. So the point here is, Gremlins was already a pretty unique horror movie, as it mixed comedy, camp, and genuine horror in ways that only the likes of Sam Raimi would fully understand. So for its sequel to dive headfirst into straight up wacky comedy and satire could be seen by many as just too much. Because most will agree that sequels are generally at their best when they do something different than the original, but have the overall tone stay the same, as that's a crucial aspect to what makes a certain movie feel the way it does in the first place. But Gremlins 2, the new batch, arguably does this backwards, having a different tone, but telling more or less the same story in order to satirize it. And once again, the results can feel decidedly weird. And looking at it strictly as a sequel, some might say it doesn't do its job too well. But as I touched on earlier, what really makes Gremlins 2, the new batch, unique is the fact that it's basically a satire of itself. And needless to say, even in a day and age where seemingly every single story template has been done and beaten to death, that is one thing that's still very rare, because it's a very hard thing to pull off. After all, in order to parody something, there has to be something to satirize. And if it's parodying itself, is there really a foundation for the satire? And this is where the movie actually benefits from copying the first movie in many respects. Because while it doesn't make for the best sequel, it makes for the perfect way to satirize itself. Because in essence, it's making fun of sequels that do just copy the original movie and try to pass it off as new. So in order to do that, it itself does that, only it plays it all for comedy. Like, for example, in the original, Gizmo accidentally spawns gremlins, which turn into menacing and dangerous creatures. So here, Gizmo accidentally spawns gremlins, and they're completely wacky and crazy. And a common feature of sequels that borrow their original's plot is to make the threat bigger and more menacing. Hence the likes of Mohawk being able to talk, as well as the gremlins being mutated in the lab, like the one that spawns wings, or the one that mutates into a spider, and the list goes on. Even if some of their menace is played straight, ultimately, the movie is making fun of the concept by having it all be absolutely ridiculous instead of played for actual horror. Or in the original, Kate tells Billy the horrifying story of why she hates Christmas, while here she starts to go into another speech about a bad experience she had on Lincoln's birthday, only this time she's cut off before she can finish. And that's probably one of the most blatant moments of self-satire in the movie, because while in the first film it's played straight and mostly for horror, in the sequel it's all to make fun of that scene. Somebody remembering something that happened on Lincoln's birthday, which isn't even an official holiday in the US anymore, is just ridiculous. As well as Phoebe Cates' absolutely deadpan delivery, all make it impossible to take seriously. On top of the fact that she's not even allowed to finish it because something more important is going on and nobody's listening. And of course, there are other things like the Gremlins actually stopping the movie and Hulk Hogan having to scare them into continuing it, or the over-the-top and corny happy ending that anybody could see coming a mile away, and the movie knows it, or Gizmo being inspired by Rambo, of all things. Really, one of the only things this movie doesn't play at least partially for satire or laughs is the climax. And even then, the second it's clear Billy's plan is working, it goes right back to being a parody of itself. And honestly, the sheer commitment the movie has to being a self-satire is very impressive. And on that particular front, might just be one of the best examples of it out there. Alright, so to put it all simply, Gremlins 2 The New Batch may not be a great sequel, but as a satire of itself and its original movie, it could be considered a masterpiece. Though once again, the very mixed reception it's had is very easy to understand. Because on top of people obviously just wanting a more traditional sequel to the first movie, there's also the fact that many, even professional critics, could misinterpret all the wacky antics and satire as just a pathetic and unsettling attempt by the movie to be funny when it should be scary, and not quite grasping the deeper layers of what it actually is. But when a movie is trying to satirize itself, that just comes with the territory. Because as I noted earlier, they are a very hard thing to pull off successfully. Heck, Gremlins 2 The New Batch's whole reception is proof of that, considering it might be among the best of its kind out there and is still viewed as a very mixed bag. But if nothing else, at least its approach has definitely cemented its status as one of the most unique sequels a classic movie has ever had. So even if it doesn't get proper credit as a self-satire, there is still that, I guess. Alright, I think that's pretty much everything I had to say on that. So now I'd like to hear what you guys think. Do you believe that Gremlins 2 The New Batch is actually pretty underrated, especially as far as being a satire of itself goes? Or do you believe that it's just a bad sequel without any nuance to it at all? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And like always, you do not have to agree with anything said in this video if you don't want to. You can feel however you want about Gremlins 2 The New Batch, and if you think I've got it all wrong, that's absolutely fine. And thank you all for watching. It is all really appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.